Hello there, peace be upon you. Welcome to Rational Religion, where we discuss religion, science, and society. My name is Omar Nasser.
And I am Tahir Nasser.
And today we're going to be discussing a few bigwigs and their views on religion, some celebrities on God and religion. The first one that we're going to be discussing is Neil de Grasse Tyson. So should we just...
Great name. Great name.
Great name. Should we just see what he says?
Absolutely. Let's go.
Do you believe in God?
Me?
Creator?
Yeah, so I'm the more I look at the universe, just the less convinced I am that there is something benevolent going on. So if your concept of a creator is someone who's all powerful and all good, that's not an uncommon pairing of powers that you might ascribe to a creator. All powerful and all good. And I look at disasters that afflict Earth and life on Earth. Volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, disease, pestilence, congenital birth defects. You look at this list of ways that life is made miserable on Earth by natural causes. And I just ask, how do you deal with that? So philosophers rose up and said, if there is a God, God is either not all powerful or not all good. I have no problems if, as we probe the origins of things, we bump up into the bearded man. If that shows up, we're good to go. Okay? Not a problem. There's just no evidence of it. And this is why religions are called faiths, collectively. Because you believe something in the absence of evidence. That's what it is. That's why it's called faith. Otherwise, we would call all religions evidence, but we don't, for exactly that reason. So I'm given what everyone describes to be the properties that would be expressed by an all-powerful being in the gods that they worship. I look for that in the universe and I don't find it. So I remain unconvinced. But if you've got some good evidence, bring it, bring it, okay? And so I don't lead with that information because what I believe should be irrelevant to anyone.
Okay, so that was Neil de Grasse Tyson doing a whistle-stop tour of all of atheism. He started with a question of suffering, and then he went into whether religions need faith and what that means, and then saying there's no evidence at the end, and then coming back to suffering. So he quoted this idea from antiquity, the problem, the so-called problem of evil, and especially relating it to natural causes of suffering. So basically the argument is, okay, you say that there's a benevolent God, so a good God. So there's a good God out there who has created the world, right? And he has power over all things in the world. And yet we encounter suffering from natural causes, which isn't obviously the fault of anybody in particular, like an earthquake or a volcano, etc. And the philosophers rising up, what he's referring to is just Epicurus, who said he said something like, basically, is God willing and able to prevent suffering? And he says, well, if he's not able, then he's not all powerful, and he's not willing, then he's not good. And if you're saying he's neither willing nor able, then he's not God. Yeah. So basically saying that the idea that he's both, that the fact that you have natural causes of suffering, plus the idea that God is omnipotent and benevolent, you can't have these three things together. So you have to sacrifice something in your conception of God. Yeah. At which point it won't be God. So I mean that's the main in reality, in many ways, that's kind of atheism's only argument, I've always thought.
Yeah, it is. It is absolutely atheism's only argument. It is.
You know, you can say all the other stuff. Well, you know, think about the children. At the end of the day.
Oh, somebody think about the children.
So, I mean, what would be your initial response to that entire problem of suffering?
I mean, it's okay. How long do you have? Well, we actually made two really good videos. Well, we would say that, wouldn't we?
A bit self-serving, isn't it?
I know, but I thought they were really good videos. Actually, they're on our channel on the question of suffering. So that's a wrap. Okay, well, we'll see you next time.
That's all we got time for, folks.
No, I mean, look, the problem of evil is a category error. That's what it actually is. So this idea that God's benevolence must manifest in a fashion that we deem to be best for us in material terms is a truly absurd notion. It takes the concept of benevolence to human beings, that a human being should be benevolent to other human beings, and effectively does what atheism always does. It places God within the category of humanity and then argues from a false premise. So the category error he makes here is basically that the benevolence of God must manifest in the same way that the benevolence of humans does.
Meaning that, I wouldn't intentionally cause an earthquake to harm you, and were I to have done that, that would be quite rude, I think.
Yeah, fairly not nice. But I think partly he's not, you see, all atheists operate from an atheistic premise. And the atheistic premise they operate from is that there is no afterlife. That's the big fundamental atheistic premise they operate from, that there's no life after death. So if you're going to talk about God as a hypothesis and as a potential concept within a framework, you have to take the corollaries that go along with that belief in God. And the major one is that you will survive life after death, that there will be accountability, that there will be judgment, and that there will be mercy and punishment. Okay? Yeah. Those are the kind of corollaries that are necessary for, in actual fact, if you're going to include God in the picture and you're going to talk about religion. So if you're going to include God in the picture, talk about all of it. So what he should have said is that, could you possibly believe in a God who causes suffering so that you may develop capacities to learn deeper qualities such as truth, steadfastness, patience, forbearance, so that God may ultimately reward you for acquiring the highest capacities in the next life, where these qualities will go on to become the foundation of your new being. And for those who suffer, all suffering would be mitigated through his bounty and through his benevolence, such that a person who had experienced immense hardship in this life will feel as if it was nothing in comparison to the reward he would get as a result of it in the next. Do you really want a God like that? Huh? Do you? So that's actually, if he was honest, that's what he should have said.
Yeah.
But the argument's a lot harder to make if you're going to talk like that.
And I think the key thing which you've alluded to there is this question of purpose. Because if you do have the God hypothesis and you're trying to have the atheist premise, or the atheist hypothesis, and I have the God hypothesis. If you do have this God hypothesis, then you're going to have to look at, what do in general the religions say is the purpose of our lives, and the purpose of our creation is to essentially come nearer to God, right? To develop love and love of God, and to worship God and to have a relationship with God. To
fundamentally develop God's attributes.
Yeah, in our
that's actually because they are the absolute fundamental building blocks of growth.
Yeah. So the Quran, for instance, talks about this. It talks about suffering, and it says that surely we will try you with something of loss of wealth and fruits and lives, but give glad tidings to the steadfast, to the patient, who, when a misfortune befalls them, say, to God do we belong, and to him shall we return. So, and then it says that they will experience more bounties thereafter. So what the Quran is there saying is that you will experience losses of every kind, of wealth, of fruits, of, health and your life and the lives of others. But give glad tidings to the steadfast, to the patient, who say, and the thing they say is incredibly important, to God do we belong, and to him shall we return. Yes. So what this is essentially saying is that what these trials and the reason why we have this suffering is they act as reminders that all the things which you're attached to in this life are temporal, and they will all die away, and they're all under God's control, and to attach your heart to them completely, and to set them as the purpose in your life is a great folly.
Yeah.
To God do we belong. So actually, the real thing that we should attach ourselves to is God, and to him shall we return. And the second part is almost like the reason for the reason for the whole thing. We're going back to him. So this whole world is temporal. We may suffer various trials here, but ultimately we're going to suffer the trial of death. We're all going to disintegrate in our material bodies, and our souls will live on.
And according to the Quran, what is known as Qiyamah, or the day of judgment, the resurrection, There's a chapter in the Quran called the Qiyamah. Qiyamah actually, has a connotation of something calamitous happening. And the founder of the Ahmadiyya community, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, he made very clear that the fundamental Qiyamah, the day of Qiyamah, for an individual is actually the day of their death. The greatest calamity referred to in the Quran is actually the day of their death, and that it is an extraordinary event. And you're absolutely right. So the loss of material things actually is about reminding you of ultimately your own eventual journey in life into the next realm. And it reminds me of a very poignant and powerful incident in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when his daughter's son was dying. And she sent a messenger to him to say, please come quickly to see him. And he said to the messenger, he said, tell her that God is taking back that which he has given, and for her to be patient. This messenger went back, gave the message, and then his daughter sent the same messenger back again to him and said, please come. And then he went over there and he picked up the child and held him in his arms, and he started crying and his tears started falling, and his companion said, what is this? You're crying. They thought he was above, the attachments, all attachments. And he said, the eyes indeed, he said something along the lines of, the eyes shed tears, that this is a natural condition of the heart. This is a manifestation of human mercy. So that is such a profound lesson in how losses enables a person to actually transform that moment into a moment whereby they actually grow in their personal qualities. And the great point that Mirza Tahir Ahmad, the fourth caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, pointed out in his amazing book Revelation Rationality, Knowledge and Truth. He had the chapter on the question of suffering, which pretty much deals with this question, as better than any other piece of writing in human history.
Unbelievable, yeah.
And he argues that, look, if you're going to eliminate suffering, why are you doing it at the level of humans? What about the poor animals? Why not eliminate suffering at the very first sentient life form, the first amoeba that ever existed? Okay, eliminate suffering for that before you get to the human being in the earthquake. Okay, and if you're going to eliminate suffering for the amoeba, then according to their own concept of Darwinian evolution and natural selection, that growth happens through trials. You would never have any evolution of consciousness or life forms beyond that initial stage, because they'd all be very happy swimming in their little amoebic soup. I
think ultimately awareness is going to lead to some forms of loss and gain. You're going to have some kind of interface with the world around you, some of which is going to be fulfilling your needs, some of which isn't going to be fulfilling needs and maybe hindering you. And that is inevitably, as your nervous system develops, going to be translated into pleasure and pain. And as we grow into, humans, for instance, we then develop, mental needs and emotional needs and these kinds of things. And our emotional attachment to other beings is going to greatly deepen. And it's something which I think most people commonly understand, which is that, it's when you suffer a loss, it's because the thing there was so good for you and you were so attached to it.
Yeah.
It's that attachment. It's the fact that you have such a positive that when it goes away, it turns into a negative for you.
Yeah, I mean, as a doctor, I experience that with my patients as well. If I see a patient die, whom I had nothing, so the cardiac arrest bell goes off, and I go and deal with a patient who I never had any relationship with at all.
Yeah.
And I see them die, I'm not affected by it in the least. I mean, that's just the honest answer. I mean, maybe people think I'm callous and heartless, but
no, I think most doctors, you go to enough cardiac arrest calls.
You when you're on call, you might go to 4 cardiac arrest calls in a day. You might see 3 people die, and that happens every week for years. So you become numb to it. But when you start dealing with patients on a long-term basis, and you get to know their families in particular and see how people love them, then you actually get really and during the COVID situation, that happened with me in intensive care as an intensive care doctor. Multiple times where I had to communicate and update these patient families because they couldn't come in to see their loved one. I had to call them up, and I saw how much they loved their family members, obviously. But it's in the back of your mind. But to have it brought to the front actually makes a big difference. So then you start to feel it in your heart, and that shows when you have an attachment to somebody, even if it's superficial, just through another third person, through conversation. Then you actually feel the suffering and the loss. Yeah.
So I think we're saying two things there. One is preliminary, one is kind of consequential, which is that you have attachments to things because we're developed sentient human beings. We have needs which are being fulfilled, and we attach ourselves to a degree to all kinds of different things. And that's the positive part of life. That's what pleasure is. And then when that's taken away, that's the pain. But that ultimately God does this in order to spiritually develop us. I think if we were to then apply this back to what Neil de Grasse Tyson was saying, he was talking about natural evil and in terms of like volcanoes and natural disasters and these kinds of things. So the overall framework within which we work is that suffering is a way of developing you spiritually, because ultimately you're not in control of the outside world, you're in control of your reaction to it and what you do afterwards. Do you become bitter? Do you treat other people worse, and do you become bitter towards God? Or do you recognize his sovereignty over everything, show gratefulness for what you have, and trying to help others in that situation? Because ultimately it's the development of those moral and spiritual qualities which is the purpose of your life. It's not for your wealth to grow. So it develops you spiritually in that way. But then we come to the issue which he mentioned, which is what about, for instance, children who suffer with congenital diseases or die of leukemia and these kinds of things. I mean, how would you deal with that in a religious outlook?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second, but I think the key point that we haven't emphasized here is that the whole point of the suffering is a loss of something that you enjoyed. That's why you suffer. Okay, suffering is a negative thing in the sense of it's a loss. It's not the gain of something. It's similar to light and dark. There's no such thing as a source of darkness. There's only a source of light, and darkness is created by the obstruction of an opaque medium. Similarly, suffering is the loss of something that you enjoyed. Okay, so the very fact that you suffer is a testament that you had actually been given something as a bestowal, as a grace, and as a favor. Okay. So otherwise you wouldn't have any suffering. So actually the experience of suffering, to then complain about it, shows an immense amount of entitlement with respect to God, who gave you that favor in the first place without you even deserving it.
Sure, but then some atheists will argue, yeah, but I had no choice in the matter. I came into existence, and then I would have rather, I don't know, have not existed. I mean, that is pretty much where some people go. I've heard that as an argument, as some kind of formidable argument.
I think the point, and this is a point addressed by the fourth Khalifa, Mirza Tahir Ahmad, in his book, he made the general point that while people do commit suicide, in general, if you were to take an unhealthy child, for example, okay, that is suffering, and this goes back to the congenital blindness argument, for example, an unhealthy child, an 8-year-old child who is suffering from a disease, and you ask that child, would you rather have your congenital disease in which you are suffering pain, or would you rather be a healthy and a happy worm? Which of the two would you prefer? Almost invariably, everybody chooses suffering with higher consciousness. And what that tells you is that the payoff of higher consciousness, which enables you to process and experience greater loss, because that is what consciousness is the ability to experience greater gain and losses fundamentally. That the elevation of consciousness that you get from that is actually a greater payoff than not having any suffering and having lower consciousness.
Right. But I mean, a child gets a disease, goes through great pain, and then dies. Is that fair? Is that compatible with a good God?
It is, because again, you're not looking at the purpose for which these things occur, and you're also not seeing. You're seeing the one half of a question. You're not seeing the answer. The answer is in the afterlife, right? The answer is in what happens consequently. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, stated that God will, on the day of resurrection, he will bring a person who had experienced the greatest amount of pleasure in life out of all human beings, and he will place him for one moment in the fire of hell, right? One moment in a state where he recognizes, which is what hell is, his own lack of good qualities, right? And is confronted with the evil he has committed in his life, but he's enjoyed everything in life. Okay, and he will then bring that person out of that state and ask him before all of mankind, did you ever experience in your entire existence, this life and the previous life, a single moment of enjoyment? And he will say, no, I never had a single moment of enjoyment. And then he will take a person who had suffered the most in life out of all human beings, place him once in paradise in God's mercy, and then bring him out and say, did you ever experience hardship in life? And the man will say, no, I've never experienced hardship in my entire existence. And the same principle is applying there. The same principle with respect to the child who has a disease in the worm is applying in that situation. That's very important to note, because in the hereafter, we are at a higher level of consciousness. So the suffering experienced at a lower level of consciousness is not comparable with the pleasure experienced at a higher level of consciousness.
Okay, so to make it more concrete, you're saying that if a child dies from some kind of painful disease, the Islamic belief is that they'll go to paradise and they'll experience great, bounties and pleasures and spiritual pleasures. It won't be a place of physical pleasure, but a place of spiritual pleasure. They'll experience such pleasures that it will more than compensate for the suffering that they went through in this life. Is that right on that count?
Yeah, but I think that's laying it out too simplistically, and I think we have to appreciate what is enjoyment in this life.
Sure, no, but I want to talk about the individual, because we talked about the capacities and the overall framework and the evolution.
No. This is a really important point. Okay, the point of what is enjoyment? Enjoyment in this life is having sensory organs by which we can experience the bounties of God, and the bounties of God are themselves a reflection of God's attributes. Okay, that's why people love nature. That's why people love going out into nature. They don't realize it, but actually, what they love is the fact that they are experiencing the reflection of God's attributes, and so their souls feel satisfied more in nature because they feel closer to God. They may not even know consciously they're thinking about God, but it's just their soul is recognizing that the attributes of God are around them. Okay, in the natural world and the beauty of the natural world.
Manifested?
Manifested, yes, absolutely. That the natural world and all of creation is a manifestation of God's beauty and God's attributes. Yeah. So when they're among that beauty, they experience that joy of being close to God. It's a spiritual high. They don't realize that that's actually what's happening. That's why the environmental movement is, for so many people, it's a pseudo religion. Okay, in the hereafter, in the life after death, it will not be a reflection of God's attributes that they will experience. It is God's attributes directly, manifested directly. So I think that's a really important point to make, to point out that it's not just spiritual pleasure versus worldly pleasure, as if they're going to be singing hymns and be like in this like lucid Zen-like state. Okay, it's actually a much higher and direct form of the enjoyment you experience in this life.
Yes, I mean, ultimately it's the pleasure that you'll experience in the next life is various forms of nearness to God. Right? Yes. Which is really the only true pleasure, I think we'd argue, in this life. Yeah. In a sense, you obviously have worldly pleasures, and they are pleasurable in their own sense, but the truest pleasure, at least, that you could have
even those pleasures. Even those are reflections of God's manifestation of God's attributes.
Right.
Yeah.
So with the child who passes away or goes through some great pain, they are not being punished. It's not that they've done something wrong. It's not some kind of form of worldly punishment, but ultimately they themselves will pass into the next life and be compensated, if you will, or will, they won't have any kind of trial which will stop them from reaching God.
No.
But then someone will ask, well, what's the point of that? Why did God bring that child into the world? Yeah. And there are various factors in causality that you can point to. Not everything is a natural, if you have congenital disease, not everything is purely natural in the sense they can be influenced by parental behavior. But let's say they're not. Even in such a case, I think we can identify a few purposes. The main thing is that they'll act as a trial for the parents as well, and act as a trial for them to spiritually develop and for them to ultimately morally and spiritually test their steadfastness. Is the religious outlook?
No, I think seeing it as like a test is not. It's not so much a test, but I know this sounds awful. It might sound awful to somebody's ears, but it's actually it's actually an opportunity. It's a very tough opportunity, obviously, the loss of a child in particular. But a good example of this is that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said to a group of women, he said to them that a woman who loses 3 children will enter paradise. And then there was one woman who stood up and said, what of a woman who's lost 2 children? And he said, even her. And he said, and then another woman stood up and said, what of a woman who's lost only 1 child? And he said, even her. Obviously, it doesn't mean every woman who's lost a child. It obviously means a woman who has turned to God, has a relationship with God, and is steadfast through the loss of that child.
Yeah.
Okay. That woman will see the fruits of that steadfastness and patience. And so actually it's an opportunity for again, going back to what you said in the beginning, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajiun. To Allah we belong and to him shall we return. It's about recognizing that this child was not mine. It always belonged to God. I may have become deluded to think that this child was mine, but it was not mine. And I do this with my own children. I look at them sometimes and I recognize and I force myself to realize these kids didn't exist. That child is basically the product of God's grace, purely. So I force myself to remember that.
Yeah, this sense of that you don't actually have real ownership and
no.
You have no real creative powers.
No.
You're part of some long chain of process which we don't really understand, with all these physical capacities and DNA and meiosis and mitosis and all these kinds of things which are laid out there. And yeah, you're right. There is this sense of ownership which I think people have with their children and with their possessions and with their own bodies and with their health and with their faculties, such that 100%. When they go, they have a sense of, this was mine, God, why have you taken it away from me? Well, the whole point is just to show that it wasn't yours.
Yes.
And the whole point is to show that actually everything of you is God's. Now, some people may complain about that. So the atheist may say, well, that's really harsh. Well, it's the truth. If it's the truth, it's not harsh. It's the greatest mercy that you can imagine, is a reminder of what's true. Yeah. Right? These faculties and these things that you believe are yours are not yours. So in the theistic outlook, under the God hypothesis, if God is reminding you of that, that is ultimately a bounty. And the way Neil de Grasse Tyson was talking about this was like, it's something religions have never thought of. It's like, have you considered?
Yeah.
The major trial in every believer's life is trials. It's like, yes, we have thought about this. It is spoken about in scripture.
This is what I find funny about the new atheists, is that the haughtiness and the aplomb with which they make their points, as if they have come across something rare and insightful. It's just anybody who's actually studied this stuff themselves is like, what? Like, literally, people who are much smarter than you were giving answers to your problem millennia ago. Those people you look down on as primitive, their level of thinking on these actual philosophical questions was way above you, buddy. Way above you.